She had not slept in 3 weeks. Selena Bowman sat in the last row of the eastbound stage car, her back against the wall, her eyes on the door at the front of the cabin. She had chosen that seat for a reason. From there, she could see every passenger who entered, every passenger who left, every face that turned toward her in the dim oil lamp light. The bag sat on the floor between her boots. She had not let it leave her side in 23 days. Not when she changed stages in Wichita. Not when she ate cold biscuits in the depot at Abilene. Not when an old woman across from her had reached down absently to move a fallen glove. And Selena's hand had moved faster, closing around the leather strap with a grip that made the old woman look up, startled, and quietly turn away. Inside the bag was a folded shawl, a small leather Bible, and a piece of paper that, if it ever reached the wrong hands, would end her life. Selena Bowman knew this because 3 states behind her, a man named Harlan Aldrich had already killed for less. She did not know how close he was. She did not know if he had picked up her trail in Topeka or lost it in Abilene. She did not know whether the rider she had seen passing the depot window 2 nights ago had been him, or simply a stranger who happened to wear the same kind of long brown coat. What she knew was simpler. She had stopped expecting kindness. That was the most dangerous thing about her. 4 months earlier, in a quiet kitchen in Caldwell Creek, a rancher named Wendell Harold had written a letter requesting a wife the same way a man writes a supply order: practical, efficient, without sentiment. He had described the ranch he ran alone, the work he needed help with, and the kind of woman who would suit it. He had not described himself. He did not yet know that the woman who would answer that letter was, at this very moment, on a train, moving westward in the dark, running for her life from a man who was already 3 days closer than she realized. This is the story of what happens when a practical arrangement becomes the only thing standing between a woman and the man who will kill her to take what she carries. It is the story of a bag never set down, a truth never spoken, and a quiet rancher who, for reasons even he did not fully understand, would choose her life over his own. This is Untold Tales of the Old West. Wendell Harold had written the letter in under 10 minutes. That probably should have told him something. He had kept it short, without sentiment. A rancher in Caldwell Creek, 34 years of age, in need of a capable woman willing to work alongside him and keep a modest home. He had not described the land. He had not described himself. He had written the word quiet twice without noticing, and he had sent the letter before he could think too hard about what he was actually asking for. That had been 4 months ago. Wendell was not a lonely man. He was a man who had arranged his entire life around not needing anyone. His ranch sat 4 miles outside the town. His nearest neighbor, an old half-deaf rancher named Pewitt, never visited. He came into Caldwell Creek only when supplies ran low. But the ranch had grown beyond what one pair of hands could manage. The east pasture needed tending, while the west fence needed mending. There were mornings when Wendell stood in the middle of it all and understood, with the cold clarity of a practical man, that he needed help. Not companionship. Help. When the reply came, he read it standing at the kitchen counter without sitting down. When he finished, he read it again. The woman who had written back had not dressed anything up. Her handwriting was measured and even. Her sentences were short. She said she was capable, that she had no objections to hard work, and that she would arrive on the 3rd Tuesday of the month if the arrangement suited him. There was no warmth in the letter. Wendell had liked that about it. He had told himself that was the only reason he said yes. What Wendell Harold did not know on the morning he sat at his kitchen table writing his confirmation letter was that the woman who had answered him had spent the previous night sleeping with a kitchen knife under her pillow. He did not know that she had chosen his advertisement specifically because it was the furthest one she could find. He did not know that the train ticket she would purchase with her last savings was, for her, not a beginning. It was an escape. And the man she was escaping from had already begun to suspect where she had gone. The morning the stage was due, Wendell drove into Caldwell Creek earlier than necessary. He sat in his wagon for 20 minutes outside the post office, pretending to check a harness buckle that did not need checking. When he finally walked to the stage stop, he stood apart from the small crowd that had gathered, because in a town the size of Caldwell Creek, the arrival of Wendell Harold's mail-order bride was apparently an event worth witnessing. He told himself he was not nervous. He was simply a man completing a practical errand. The stage rolled in just past noon, dust-covered and loud. 2 men stepped down first, then an older woman with a carpet bag, then a pause. Then Selena stepped down onto the street, and Wendell did not move for a moment. She was not what he had pictured. She stood straight. Her dress was plain but neat. She had one trunk and one small leather bag that she kept pressed against her side. She scanned the faces around her without any of the anxiety he had expected. When her eyes landed on him and they found him quickly, she did not smile. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at something they have been trying to imagine and are now comparing to the reality. Whatever she found in that comparison she kept to herself. Mr. Harold, Miss Bowman. There was a pause in which neither of them seemed to know whose turn it was to speak next. Then Wendell picked up her trunk without asking and carried it to the wagon. She followed without comment. He helped her up to the seat. She settled herself without thanking him, which he found both reasonable and, for some reason he could not name, slightly irritating. The bag stayed in her lap, not on the floor of the wagon, not behind her on the bench, in her lap, both hands on it. Wendell noticed. He did not say anything. They left Caldwell Creek in silence. The road stretched out ahead of them, 4 miles of open country. The quiet between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was the quiet of 2 people who had agreed on terms and were now, for the first time, sitting close enough to wonder whether the other one intended to honor them. What Wendell did not see, because he was watching the road, was the way her hand tightened on the strap of the bag every time the wagon dipped into a rut. What Selena did not see, because she was watching the horizon, was that 2 days behind them, in a town she had passed through 4 nights ago, a man in a long brown coat had paid the depot clerk $3 for the names of every passenger who had purchased a westbound ticket that week. Hers had been on the list. The ranch house was smaller than she had imagined, but cleaner. The floors were swept. The curtains were plain but hung straight. The kitchen was spare but organized. It told her something about Wendell Harold that his letter had not. He showed her the bedroom, her bedroom. He made it clear by the way he said nothing, simply opening the door and waiting. She stepped inside and set her small bag on the chair by the window. "Supper is at 6, Wendell said from the doorway. "I start work at first light. I don't expect you to match that until you know the place." "I'll match it by the end of the week," Selena said, without turning from the window. A pause, longer this time. "All right," he said, and left. She stood at that window for a long moment after his footsteps faded down the hall. Outside, the east pasture ran gold and flat toward a tree line she did not know the name of yet. The sky above it was enormous in the way that skies only are when there is nothing tall enough to interrupt them. She did not unpack the bag. She set it beside the bed, within reach. That night, she ate at his table without speaking, unless spoken to. She washed the dishes without being asked, and when she went to bed, she placed the bag on the floor beside her pillow. She did not sleep. She closed her eyes for short stretches and listened, for hoofbeats on the road, for boots on the porch, for the particular sound of a man arriving who had no business being there. 240 miles east of Caldwell Creek, in a depot town called Stafford, a man in a long brown coat sat across from a railway clerk with a $5 gold piece on the table between them. The clerk was sweating. Harlan Aldrich was not. He was a broad man, well dressed for the frontier, with the kind of clean appearance that men in this part of the country usually only managed on the day they were buried. His coat was wool, not oilcloth. His hat was new. His boots were polished. The kind of man who spent money on appearance in places where appearance had no practical value. The clerk slid a piece of paper across the table. Aldrich looked at it, read it, read it again. Then he folded it once, placed it inside the pocket of his coat, and stood. There was a woman, he said. His voice was smooth, unhurried. Travelling alone, she would have come through here about 10 days ago, carrying a leather bag she would not have set down. The clerk hesitated. "I see a lot of women, sir." This one had eyes that did not stop watching the door. The clerk swallowed. "I remember her," he said. Aldrich nodded once, slowly. "Where did she buy a ticket to?" The clerk's hand was visibly shaking now. He pulled a ledger from beneath the counter and turned it around so Aldrich could see. Harlan Aldrich read the entry. He smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was not unkind either. It was the smile of a man who had finally found something he had misplaced and was already calculating how long it would take to retrieve it. "Caldwell Creek," he said quietly. "Of course." He left a second gold piece on the table. He walked out into the afternoon sun. By nightfall, he was 12 miles closer. Selena was up before Wendell every morning. By the fourth day, the coffee was already made when he came in from the barn. By the seventh, she had begun making it slightly stronger than she took it herself, exactly the way he took his. She had not mentioned this. He had not explained that he had noticed. It simply was. She mended the curtain in the front room that had been torn since spring. She reorganized the pantry in a way that made immediate sense. She learned the rhythm of the ranch with a speed that would have impressed Wendell had he not been busy being suspicious of it. That was the word he kept coming back to. Suspicious. Not of anything specific. Selena had done nothing wrong. She had done everything right. And somehow, that was the thing that sat uneasy with him. It was on the 8th morning that Wendell sat at his kitchen table with his coffee and finally allowed himself to think clearly about what he had let into his house. In his experience, people showed their edges early. A person who had not shown a single edge in 7 days was either genuinely even-tempered or very carefully managed. Wendell Harold had known enough of the world to understand the difference between the two, but it wasn't her composure that troubled him. He could have lived with a quiet woman. He had asked for one. What troubled him was something he could not quite name yet. The way her eyes moved toward the window every time a horse passed on the distant road. The way she had positioned her bed so she could see the door from the pillow. The way she had asked him on the 3rd evening about the locks on the property, not as a woman concerned about strangers, but as a woman who had lived too long with the specific knowledge of what a broken lock costs. She had not come here to be married. She had come here to disappear. He drank his coffee slowly and looked out the window at the eastern road, the road that led, eventually, back toward whatever she had come from. Wendell Harold had spent 11 years building a life that did not require him to need anyone. And here he was, on a quiet Tuesday morning in a kitchen he had built with his own hands, understanding for the first time that the woman in the next room was the first person in those 11 years he had no intention of letting go of. He did not know how that had happened. He was not sure he wanted to. It was on the 8th day that the first crack appeared. He had ridden out to the north pasture before sunup to check on a section of fence that the wind had been testing all week. When he came back mid-morning, his ranch hand, a quiet older man named George Sutton, who worked 3 days a week, was standing near the barn with his hat in his hands. "She all right?" Wendell asked, before he had fully dismounted. George nodded slowly. Ryder came through, stopped at the gate, asking questions. Wendell looped the reins over the post. What kind of questions? Whether a woman had come to stay here recent, what she looked like. George turned his hat once in his hands. I told him. I didn't know what he was talking about. Wendell looked toward the house. The kitchen window was visible from where he stood, and through it he could see Selena moving, unhurried, as though the morning were ordinary. Did he say who he was? Said he was a cousin, looking for family. George's tone made clear what he thought of that explanation. Wendell thanked him. He went inside. Selena was at the kitchen table, shelling beans. She looked up when Wendell came in and read something in his face immediately. He could see her read it. He could see the small adjustment she made, the way her hand slowed without stopping. "There was a rider at the gate this morning," Wendell said. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She set down the pod in her hand with the deliberate care of someone making sure their fingers did not tremble. What did he want? He was asking about a woman. The kitchen was very quiet. What did you tell him? I wasn't here. George sent him off. Wendell pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Selena. She looked at him. I'm not going to ask you something you're not ready to answer, he said. But I need to know if there's something coming toward this property that I should be prepared for. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer at all. There is a man, she said finally. He believes he has a claim on me. He does not. But he is not the kind of man who accepts that distinction. She picked the bean pod back up. I did not come here to bring trouble to your door, Mr. Harold. That was never my intention. Intentions don't always get a vote, he said. Something shifted in her expression, not quite pain, not quite gratitude, something in between that he did not have a word for. No, she said quietly, they don't. He sat with that for a moment. What's his name? Wendell asked. She hesitated. Aldrich. Harlan Aldrich. He did not know the name, but the way she said it with a flatness that had been practiced over time told him everything about what the name meant to her. All right, he said. She looked up. All right, I heard what you said. I'm not sending you back out on that road. He stood and pushed the chair in. But I need you to think tonight about what you want me to know, and tomorrow, when you're ready, you tell me. We will figure out the rest from there. He went back outside before she could respond. That night, neither of them slept. She lay in her bed with the bag beside her, listening for hoofbeats on the eastern road, knowing that the man she was hiding from was no longer hypothetical. He was real. He was close, and the man 2 rooms away had just put himself between them without being asked. Wendell lay in his own bed 2 rooms away, listening to the same wind, thinking about the eastern road, and understanding that whatever came up that road, he was going to meet it standing. Both of them watched the sky go from black to grey. Neither of them said a word the next morning until breakfast was on the table. She came to the porch that evening at sunset. Wendell was already there, sitting in the wooden chair at the far end, his eyes on the eastern road that ran flat out of the property toward the horizon. The sky was turning the color of old copper. She stood at the railing for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "I left Tennessee in the middle of the night." She was not looking at him. "My father arranged a match with Harlan Aldrich 2 years ago. I was not consulted. When I said I would not go through with it, my father said I did not have that choice." She paused. "I decided I did." Wendell said nothing. He let her talk. "I answered your letter because it was the furthest advertisement I could find. I thought distance would be enough." She turned to look at him then. "I should have told you before I came. That was wrong of me, and I know it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why didn't you?" he asked. "Because I was afraid you wouldn't take me," she said simply, without decoration. The honesty of it landed harder than he expected. "There is one more thing I need to tell you," she said. She went inside. She came back with the bag. She set it on the porch rail between them, and for the first time in 26 days, she opened it. Inside, beneath the folded shawl and the small leather Bible, was a document. She drew it out carefully and set it on the rail. In the last of the evening light, Wendell could see it was a land deed. He leaned forward and read the name on it, Selena Elaine Bowman. "That is my mother's land," she said, 40 acres in Greer County. "She left it to me when she died, not to my father. He contested it for 2 years and lost. That was when he decided the fastest way to take what he could not inherit was to marry me to a man who would." She tapped the edge of the document. "Harlan Aldrich has been trying to get his hands on this piece of paper since before I even understood what it meant." Wendell sat back. The pieces arranged themselves quietly in his mind. The measured letters, the single bag, the eyes that counted exits. None of it had been coldness. All of it had been survival. 40 miles east of Caldwell Creek, Harlan Aldrich reined in his horse beside a small trading post just before sundown. The proprietor was an older woman who had run the post alone since her husband died. Aldrich was polite to her. He always was. With women he had no use for. He bought a sack of oats. He paid in coin. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether she had seen a young woman pass through in the last 2 weeks, traveling alone, carrying a leather bag. The woman thought for a moment. "There was a Bowman girl on the westbound stage," she said, "about 10 days back. Quiet. Didn't say much. The driver mentioned her at the time on account of how she wouldn't let him put her bag in the rear box. Held it on her lap the whole ride." Aldrich smiled. "And where was the stage headed?" "Caldwell Creek." Aldrich nodded once. He thanked her. He paid an extra $1 for the information, which the woman accepted without comment, though she watched him go with an expression that suggested she would remember his face for some time. He mounted his horse. By morning, he was 20 more miles closer. By the morning after that, he would be at her gate. They came on a Friday. Wendell was at the creek bank when he heard them. Not 1 or 2 horses, several, moving without urgency up the main drive, the way men move when they do not expect resistance. He came around the side of the barn at a pace that looked unhurried, and was not. There were 5 of them. He recognized the man at the front, not from personal acquaintance, but from the particular way he sat a horse, like someone who had spent a long time being obeyed. His name was Aldrich. Aldrich looked at Wendell with an expression that was almost friendly. "I'm looking for a woman named Selena Bowman," he said. His voice was smooth. "I have reason to believe she is here." "This is the Harold Ranch," Wendell said, "and the woman you are describing is my wife." The word landed in the yard between them like something dropped from a great height. Aldrich's easy expression did not disappear entirely. It just tightened at the edges. "Is that so?" "Married 3 weeks ago. I have the paperwork if you would like to see it." Wendell did not move from where he stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for anything. He simply stood with the stillness of a man who had decided, for the first time in a long time, exactly what he was willing to do. Aldrich looked toward the house for a long moment. The front door opened. Selena stepped onto the porch. She had a rifle in her hands. She was not aiming it. She was holding it loose and ready, the way a woman who had grown up around men with bad intentions learned to hold one. Aldrich saw her. She saw him. Whatever passed between them in that moment did not need words. He turned his attention back to Wendell. "Her father will want to know," he said. Wendell took a single step forward. "Her father lost his vote on her life the day he tried to sell it. You can tell him I said so. And the next man who rides up that road asking for her leaves on the back of his own horse, or not at all." The claim ended at my gate. The silence that followed had weight to it. Aldrich's 2 men shifted in their saddles. The horses shook their heads against the flies. The wind moved through the dry grass at the edge of the yard. Then Aldrich did something Wendell had not expected. He laughed. Not loudly, just once, softly, like a man who had been beaten at a card table by a player he had underestimated and could not quite believe it. "All right," he said. "All right, Mr. Harold." He turned his horse without another word. His men turned with him. They rode back through the gate, the way they had come. They did not come back. Wendell watched until the dust settled and the road was empty, and the only sound was the wind moving through the dry grass. He stayed on the porch a full minute after they disappeared. Then the front door opened, and Selena stepped out. She stood beside him and looked at the empty road and said nothing for a long time. "Is it over?" she asked. "For today," he said honestly. "Men like that don't always stop, but they look for easier targets. We made this one harder." She nodded slowly. He looked at her. She was still watching the road with those careful eyes, but something in them was different now. The counting of exits was still there. Maybe it would always be there. But underneath it was something that had not been there the morning she stepped off the stage, something that looked a little like rest. The garden came in the spring. Selena knelt in the soft dirt at the north end of the property, planting tomato seedlings in long, even rows. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of morning that makes the world look newly arrived. Her hair was loose and the wind moved through it, the way wind moves through prairie grass. Wendell stood on the porch with 2 cups of coffee in his hands, watching her. She did not know he was there. Or perhaps she did, and had decided not to turn around. He stood there for a long time. He had spent 11 years on this ranch alone. He had built every fence. He had repaired every roof. He had buried 2 horses and 3 dogs at the south end of the property. He had told himself, more than once, that solitude was a gift you gave yourself when the world had taught you not to expect more. He understood now that he had been wrong about that, not because he had needed her, because he had not known he was allowed to want her. He stood with that thought for a long moment. The wind moved through the prairie grass. The morning kept coming. She felt his presence finally and turned. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood. She walked toward the porch, and she was smiling. And Wendell Harold understood at that moment that he had been wrong about exactly one more thing. He had thought, when he wrote that letter, that he was asking for help. He had not known he was asking for the rest of his life. She took the cup of coffee from his hand. "It's strong," she said. "That's how you take it." She looked at him. "It's how you take it, too," he almost smiled. "I know," he said. They stood there on the porch and looked out at the garden and the morning and the quiet land, and they did not say anything else for a long time. There was nothing that needed saying. This is where we leave them. A quiet ranch, a quiet morning, a garden coming up out of cold ground, and two people who had agreed once on paper to a practical arrangement and discovered, slowly and without ceremony, that the life they had given up on had been waiting for them in a place neither had thought to look. If this story stayed with you, drop your city or your country in the comments below. I'd love to know how far it traveled. The next one is already coming. It begins with a woman who stepped off a stage in a town called Caldwell Creek and walked straight up to a man the whole town had stopped speaking to. What she said to him in front of half the street and what he said back would change both of their lives forever. But that is a different story. Subscribe so the next one finds you. Until then, ride safe, partner. This has been Untold Tales of the Old West.